Imagine a world where members of Congress could only serve 2 terms. Would this change lead to a government that truly represents the people? Or would it create a chaotic environment where politicians don't have enough time to make a difference? Welcome back to where we explore some of the most intriguing questions about how our world could be different. Today, we're diving deep into the question, let's start with a bit of background. In the United States, the House of Representatives has a 2-year term and the Senate has a 6-year term. But unlike the presidency, which has been limited to 2 terms since 1951, members of Congress can serve as many terms as they're able to win. For example, former Senator Robert Byrd served for over 50 years. Supporters of the current system argue that this setup helps Congress members build expertise, form lasting relationships, and gain institutional knowledge, which all contribute to effective governance over time. However, some people argue that term limits would bring fresh perspectives and break the grip of career politicians. So let's dive into what would really happen if we put a strict 2-term cap on members of both the House and the Senate. We'll look at everything from experience and policy continuity to partisanship, political campaigning, and the impact on voters. One of the most immediate effects of a 2-term limit would be on legislative experience. Members of Congress today spend years, sometimes decades, learning the ins and outs of lawmaking, understanding the procedural complexities, and building relationships that help them get things done. A 2-term limit could mean a revolving door of new representatives, which might bring fresh ideas, but it also raises the question. Imagine a freshman congressperson navigating a complex bill on, say, healthcare reform. With only 2 terms, they'd have limited time to learn the nuances, which could make them more reliant on outside experts, including lobbyists. Lobbyists who don't have term limits might end up as the real power brokers behind the scenes, guiding and even influencing new, less experienced lawmakers who need help making decisions quickly. This could inadvertently increase the power of special interests, something term limits were supposed to diminish. Some argue that a Congress without experienced lawmakers would struggle to address complex long-term issues, while others believe that limiting terms could open up opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds to bring unique expertise. But the question remains, is that trade-off worth the loss of experienced legislators? Then there's the issue of policy continuity. Many legislative efforts, especially around issues like infrastructure, healthcare, and climate change, take years or even decades to implement effectively. Long-term projects need steady guidance and commitment. If every member of Congress were limited to 2 terms, it could lead to constant shifts in priorities, with each new wave of lawmakers focused on their own agendas and timelines. Take climate legislation, for example. It's a complex area that requires deep understanding and consistent long-term strategies. But with term limits, members of Congress may not feel the same responsibility for seeing a long-term project through to the end. They might instead focus on short-term wins that they can point to before their terms are up, leaving unfinished projects for the next group to either pick up or discard. This high turnover could lead to a kind of legislative whiplash, where each new batch of lawmakers shifts the focus, never building on their predecessors' work. Supporters of term limits argue that this turnover would keep Congress in tune with the public's current needs. However, the loss of continuity could stall or even reverse progress on critical issues. If Congress were limited to 2 terms, we'd likely see big changes in the types of people who run for office. Today, many congressional seats are occupied by career politicians who have served for decades. With a 2-term limit, people with different professional backgrounds, such as educators, scientists, doctors, and business owners, might be more inclined to run, knowing they won't need to commit their entire lives to a political career. This could bring a more diverse set of skills and perspectives to Congress, potentially leading to policies that are more relevant to the real-world experiences of everyday Americans. Imagine a Congress where people cycle in with fresh perspectives and specialized knowledge about specific issues. This might make for a legislative body that's more dynamic and responsive to current needs, but there's a flip side. Knowing they'll only have 2 terms, some people might not feel it's worth the time, money and energy it takes to run for office, especially with the high costs of campaigns. And without the incentive of a long-term career, we could see fewer people willing to dive into politics at all, leaving Congress to those who can afford to campaign without worrying about what comes next. So while the candidate pool could become more diverse, there's a chance that only those with financial resources or strong political connections would end up filling those seats. Another interesting effect of a 2-term limit could be on partisanship. Today, members of Congress often stay in office long enough to develop strong party ties. They build alliances and fall in line with party agendas, knowing it can help them stay in office longer. If Congress members knew they had only 2 terms, they might feel freer to act on their own values and the interests of their constituents rather than towing the party line. This could result in more independent voting patterns and a Congress less bound by party loyalty. Members may feel less pressure to follow party agendas, which could lead to more bipartisan efforts. However, without the time to build cross-party relationships and trust, term limits could have the opposite effect, increasing polarization and making it harder to pass legislation. Think of it this way: if everyone's new and inexperienced, they may rely more heavily on party leadership for guidance, which could make partisan divides even sharper. So, while term limits might reduce some party loyalty, they could also disrupt the personal relationships that often lead to compromise and cooperation. Let's also talk about how term limits might change political campaigns and fundraising. In today's Congress, representatives and senators often spend years building war chests for re-election campaigns. They're constantly fundraising to secure their seats for the next term, which means they're often focused on campaign finance rather than actual governance. With term limits, members wouldn't need to worry about re-election indefinitely. This could allow them to focus more on legislating and less on fundraising. But it's also possible that knowing they'll only serve 2 terms could lead many members to start planning for their next career step long before their terms are up. In this scenario, some members might be motivated to secure influential or well-paying jobs after Congress, perhaps in lobbying or consulting, rather than focusing on their current role. This revolving door between Congress and lobbying firms could actually become more pronounced, with former lawmakers moving directly from legislative roles into jobs where they influence their successors. So while term limits might reduce the pressure to fundraise, they could also create more incentives for members to plan their next move, creating potential conflicts of interest. Finally, let's look at how term limits might change the relationship between Congress and the public. With high turnover, voters might feel like they have a greater influence on who represents them, as new faces would constantly be coming in and out of office. This could foster a sense of accountability, with lawmakers feeling pressure to deliver results quickly, knowing they won't be in office long enough to coast. However, the downside of this turnover is that the public may struggle to build a connection with their representatives. If Congress members are changing every few years, voters might not feel the same familiarity or trust. Additionally, with so many new lawmakers coming in regularly, the legislative branch might feel disconnected from the public in a different way, one that's hard to quantify but could lead to a decrease in public trust. Would frequent changes in Congress make voters feel more empowered and engaged, or would it erode the public's confidence in a government that constantly reshuffles? It's a question with no easy answer, but it would undoubtedly reshape how people view and interact with their government. So what if both branches of Congress were limited to 2 terms? It's a complex question with a lot of potential consequences. On one hand, we might see a fresher, more diverse Congress that's more responsive to current issues and less tied to party lines. On the other hand, we could end up with a less experienced, more fragmented Congress that relies heavily on outside influence and struggles to maintain policy continuity. In the end, whether 2-term limits would help or hurt Congress depends on what kind of government we want. Should Congress be a place for long-term experts, or should we prioritize bringing in new perspectives? There are pros and cons on both sides, but one thing is clear: this change would fundamentally alter the structure of American government. What do you think? Would two-term limits create a more effective Congress, or would the risks outweigh the benefits? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into hypothetical scenarios, be sure to subscribe too for more thought-provoking explorations.